Do we know how these fires started?
In these sorts of fires, there really aren't any natural ignition sources in a county with millions of people living in it. They're just the fact of modern life. For folks who've never experienced a wind-driven wildfire up close and personal, I think it's difficult sometimes to get a sense of scale regarding the real enormity. Imagine if you were in a blizzard, except that instead of snowflakes, all of them were embers. And instead of 40-mile-an-hour winds, it was, in some cases, 100 miles an hour. Okay. And that's what you're up against.
The underbrush is what will carry the fire from one home to another.
Billions of hot embers raining down.
This is StarTalk, Explainer Edition, and I've got with me Daniel Swain. Take us to this season right now in California, or West Coast more broadly. Isn't January the rainy season in Southern California?
Well, typically, yes. January would be pretty close to the middle of the rainy season in California generally, and specifically in Southern California, where the fires are currently burning. So far this season, about the southern third of the state of California, so including all of LA County, the whole LA basin, San Diego, Santa Barbara, pretty much hasn't rained at all. We're having this conversation in mid-January. That is now the driest start to this season. And by the season in California, we talk about the water year, which usually starts October 1st and runs through the end of the winter rainy season. It's been bone dry. It's a no-show this far in the south, though remarkably, that is not true in Northern California, where some places have seen one of their wettest starts to the rainy season on record. So we have in California this year so far what I call a precipitation dipole.
That's very physics of you. Explain to me the thermodynamics of what happens if it hasn't rained. What's the actual driving mechanism here?
Right. Well, this is where we're getting into the nitty-gritty and the tricky stuff, because there's actually a few different reasons why this is really important. First of all, for some additional California climatology lesson, the winter, the late fall and the early winter, I should say, are the time of year when that part of the state sees what are known as offshore winds, sometimes called the Santa Ana winds. Essentially what they are very strong, sometimes violently strong, as we saw last week with gusts to 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, hurricane speeds,
plus even force winds in some cases that blow down slopes. So these are winds that actually blow down the mountain slopes and cascade downward into the valleys below. And in doing so, as they descend and as the ambient pressure increases, often they tend to warm and dry that air, like compressing air in a bicycle pump. And so these winds are not only very strong, but they're essentially like an atmospheric blow dryer. So not only do you have 70, 80, 90 plus mile an hour wind gusts, but you also have relative humidity that gets pretty close to zero in some cases. So there's almost no moisture in the atmospheric column whatsoever, all the way up to the top of the troposphere.
The term blow dry, if something had any moisture in it at all, if you blow hot, unmoist air across it, it's going to dry out and become kindling.
So that's not so unusual to have these blow dryer winds at this time of year. But the key difference between how things would usually be this time of year versus how things were in early January when these fires broke out is that it was just ridiculously bone dry. And that is not typically the case in early January.
So the combination of the two was especially potent. Not to put words in your mouth, but you're saying the underbrush is what will carry the fire from one home to another, right? Plus the wind and the ash through the atmosphere.
Most of coastal Southern California is a semi-arid environment with actually quite dense and in some cases you could even call it lush vegetation, at least in a wet year. So there's an overabundance of plants and vegetation that for various ecological reasons is intrinsically flammable. A lot of the brush in Southern California is called chaparral, and it produces oils within the plant tissues that are particularly flammable, that make it burn. Some firefighters will say burn like gasoline when conditions are otherwise conducive.
Whoa. Do we know how these fires started?
What is clear is that in these sorts of fires, there really aren't any natural ignition sources. The primary natural ignition source for wildfire on Earth, of course, as you'd expect, is lightning. There are some other less common ones like volcanic eruptions, and if you get very unlucky with a rock slide and two rocks happen to create a spark, you might produce one that way. But generally speaking, in this part of the world, because we know there was no lightning, there will be some sort of human-caused spark. So it could be a power line, it could be some carelessness from an errant cigarette butt, or a residual smoldering from fireworks is one hypothesis. So there's any number of potential sparks in a county with millions of people living in it. They're just the fact of modern life. But it will almost inevitably turn out to be the case that it was some sort of human activity that created that initial spark.
NASA has a website that shares with the viewer images taken from space of Earth's surface, and they track wildfires anywhere they are on Earth when they are rotated into view for the camera. And I was just reviewing it last night, and the LA wildfires are one of several that are going on right now around the world. LA appears to be sort of more devastating than most, but the idea that the wildfire is something we're living with, is this the new normal?
The question of how we think about wildfire on a warming planet is a critical one. And the reality is that there has been wildfire, which is really just a way of saying vegetation burning, for as long as we've been on a planet that has had oxygen in its atmosphere and significant biomass that's available to burn. So in a certain sense, there have been vegetation fires on Earth for as long as there have been plants on Earth, which has been a while.
You can have a wildfire that burns more acres than what's going on now, but if it doesn't engulf homes, it's just a wildfire in the forest, and we try to put it out or let it burn ecologically, whatever. So it's the combination of such a widespread wildfire on top of residences that is especially devastating.
The classic way of thinking about disasters is that you have both a natural hazard, a fire, a flood, or drought, or whatever it is. You also have to have population exposed to it. So it's the classic if a tree falls in the forest type situation.
Yeah, so that exposure, especially when it involves people who are wealthy, it comes to the very front of the news.
So there are some elements here that are familiar from knowledge of what has happened before, but then there are also some pieces that are different. The scope of the losses, of course, are enormous and record-breaking, but also it is not typical to see this ongoing level of extreme fire risk in Southern California as we head into mid-January. That is something that we generally do not see. So it's a combination of familiar risk factors along with some things that are a lot less typical that we're seeing right now.
So in terms of fighting these fires, there's a lot of talk about water pressure within hydrants, and we see those magnificent images of helicopters dropping water. That all feels like just a drop in a bucket, a literal, figurative drop in a bucket. What power do these methods have over fires of such magnitude?
For folks who've never experienced a wind-driven wildfire up close and personal, I think it's difficult sometimes to get a sense of scale regarding the real enormity of the dynamics of this sort of event. I think there's a perception in many cases that a wildfire sort of progresses contiguously and linearly across the landscape, some wall of flames that moves from point A to point B. And what we see during these extreme wind-driven fires, like occurred in the LA basin recently, are that it's not generally this contiguous wall of flame, but it is this essentially a snowstorm of billions of hot embers raining down, blowing horizontally. And there's remarkable footage of this from folks on the ground as the disaster was unfolding. And so the challenge is that...
By the way, I'm imaging that in my head. Billions of embers.
Billions upon billions.
And the faster the wind speed, the heavier is the ember that it can send airborne.
Imagine if you were in a blizzard, except that instead of snowflakes, all of them were embers. And instead of 40-mile-an-hour winds, it was, in some cases, 100 miles an hour. Okay. And that's what you're up against.
That's crazy. So tell me about fire suppression with helicopters. How well does that work?
And we've actually seen some very good early stops and successes on other fires that didn't become disastrous in the same week. But the challenge is that you can't operate those aircraft when it's extremely windy. So under the very most dire fire weather conditions is when the suppression tactics we have available become the least effective.
That's bad.
Obviously, the reason why there was such a disaster in LA County last week is not just because of the recent weather conditions. It's not just because of climate change. It's not just because people live in the high risk zones. There's all of these factors are at play. And the reality is, in a lot of fire-prone parts of the U.S., and this is not just true in LA, but throughout California and frankly all around the country, we don't build individual structures or neighborhoods to be fire resilient. Certainly not as much as we could and probably should be doing. So there is a lot you can do.
And if you did, and the insurance company reflected that in your rates versus other people's rates, that would be quite a force operating on people's rebuilding plans.
Yes, and I really, folks sometimes say, now is not the time to discuss the causes of the disaster as people are still suffering, but people are also making decisions about what to do next, and that includes where and how to rebuild. And so we should be having those conversations now so we don't make the same mistakes that we made that allowed this to happen in the first place.
I kept thinking some of this could be mitigated if the power lines were all buried. Because if a wind knocks over a power line or there's a spark.
Many of the most destructive and deadliest wind-driven fires have preferentially actually been started by power lines because they're susceptible to falling over when it's windy or trees fall on them. And so it's helpful to the extent that it prevents those kinds of initial sparks. We often wonder why there are so many wildfire ignitions. How can there possibly be so many human-caused ignitions if there aren't arsonists running around? And it's not to say there's never any arson at all, but it turns out that's not the primary reason why we see so many of these ignitions. It's just that modern life entails sort of a lot of potential ignition sources, either through accidents or happenstance or carelessness sometimes. But in a place with millions of people living in it, you have to make sure that all of their activities of modern life don't accidentally generate an errant spark under high wind conditions. And that's just a really tall order.
When you study extreme events, how often do your models predict a record-setting extreme event?
This is where my perspective as a climate scientist who has a history in meteorology, I think, comes in handy. Because ultimately, I think the way we tangibly experience climate change is through these episodic shift in extreme and even unprecedented weather events. It's less through the day-to-day average incremental increase in temperature, but it's when climate change pushes an event that would have been a pretty big deal into territory where now it's an extremely big deal, and it's
or disaster. Yeah. Just from a bad storm to a disaster.
So climate change essentially pushes us increasingly outside the envelope of historical experience, and this becomes a real problem in places where we have inherent thresholds built into things. And that is precisely the problem. Is the Earth's climate, of course, has always been changing, but that change right now is extremely rapid, and that is going to outpace, in many cases, if we're not careful, our ability to adapt to it, and in many cases, ecosystems' ability to adapt to it as well. And fundamentally, that is the challenge with climate change, is it's the rate of change problem and the fact that our world is built around stationarity in very many critical ways.
Well, if I can give a shout out to one of my producers for Cosmos, Jason Clark. He lived in Pacific Palisades. He lost his home. His family is safe. So just giving him a shout out.
Yeah. And I've personally heard from a number of folks who have actually lost their homes. In fact, I think this might be, for me personally, the single wildfire event where I've encountered the most people who have some pretty harrowing stories, frankly.
As we explore the vastness of the universe, it's easy to lose sight of the challenges unfolding here on Earth. The recent wildfires in Los Angeles are a stark reminder of how our planet is rapidly changing. To better understand the fires, their causes and impacts, we dug into some insightful articles that provided valuable context. Sourced from over 90 outlets, one headline discusses the role of high winds and highlights how these winds, combined with extreme drought after wet winters, are exasperating the situation. According to the LA Times, this phenomenon, often called climate whiplash, is intensifying. Curious about what climate whiplash means? We found research published in Nature that explains how this phenomenon is speeding up globally. In California, hydroclimate whiplash has doubled the risk of wildfires by encouraging vegetation growth during wet winters only to dry it out in extreme droughts. Lead author Daniel Swain states this cycle creates a perfect storm for flammable conditions. Ground News also showed that 88% of the sources covering this issue are rated as highly factual, giving us confidence in the data and reporting. Being open to new ideas and always refining your research is the most important lesson here, something our longtime partners at Ground News really help with. They're a small team, led by a former NASA engineer dedicated to adding clarity to an often contradictory media landscape by calculating how credible every source reporting on a story actually is. And if you want to dive even deeper, Ground News daily briefings break down the day's top stories by clearly highlighting facts, points of agreement, and even opposing views. Exposing yourself to diverse viewpoints ensures you're not just critically informed enough to think you're right, but to even challenge your assumptions and grow. So, if you're just as curious as us, subscribe to Ground News today. We're giving our viewers 50% off their Unlimited Access Vantage plan, their biggest discount of the year. Just go to ground.news/StarTalk or scan the QR code. We really can't recommend them enough. Now, let's get back to the show.
So, Daniel, just let's summarize this conversation by maybe you can give a top 5 list of things people can do moving forward to minimize this risk of losing your home, given the devastation that has occurred and given that so much rebuilding will occur going forward. What would be your top 5 recommendations going forward?
Absolutely. And I'll start big picture and sort of zoom in.
And by the way, if it's 6, then let it be 6.
All right.
I don't want to restrict you to 5.
I won't be constrained by N. I'll start big picture and then zoom in, I think maybe to individual level. You know, on the large scale, I think one thing we're going to have to come to terms with is that there will be more fire in a warming world. And that's not entirely a bad thing. Most of the ecosystems in the world need some amount of fire for their health and resilience. And so, you know, to make it a specific point of action, I think we need to embrace the spectrum of fire, recognizing that it can be bad and catastrophic on one end, but also there is such thing as good fire, beneficial fire, and to harness it more actively through prescribed burning, indigenous cultural burning on much larger scales, and to have the collective acceptance of that, I think is maybe the largest scale, most important thing across different landscapes. Now, zooming in a little bit.
But that's not an action, that's more an awareness, correct?
Well, we need to do it. Someone needs to be the firelighters. We need to have policies in place that allow us to actually do it. So there are some, public policy action items. There are some funding. We need the crews and the personnel and the equipment, available to do this regularly and safely. So, baked into that are the big picture policy world and advocacy things that I think we need there. But to zoom in a little bit more, as we get to community scale, thinking about, how we build either new communities or redesign existing communities, either in the wake of a disaster or even better, before the disaster strikes, to facilitate, if there is a disaster, make it easier to escape, make it easier for firefighters to get in. Sometimes this is in terms of how the road networks are operated or adding additional emergency ingress or egress routes. This is something that's now becoming commonplace in Western U.S. communities, is they'll add an escape route that wasn't there before, for example.
By the way, after 9/11, there was a building code change in New York that required stairwells of all high-rises to be twice as wide for newly built ones, to be twice as wide as they were previously designed. Because what they found in the tray towers is the firefighters were going up the stairs while other people were coming down, and they couldn't do that simultaneously. And so it greatly impeded the flow of people to where they needed to go. And I've seen that in all new buildings, and I think to myself, well, there's some learning that takes place from disaster, and here it is implemented.
Right, and so that's a good analogy, and in this case, it just would take place in the case of roads. And then as we continue to zoom in, to the individual level and the individual community and even the individual homeowner or building owner level. What your house is built from really matters. How it's built really matters. And even things as simple as retrofitting existing structures to have, for example, ember-resistant vents. This sounds like a triviality, but imagine, go back to the analogy of a blizzard with 1 billion embers in it. Most of the houses that burn down in these situations often burn from the inside out, meaning that an ember somehow, borne by the wind, has gotten blown into a gap and found its way into someone's attic or their living room. And then it starts a small fire on the couch or on the pile of newspapers, and then it goes from there. So just by preventing embers from entering your house, assuming it's under bombardment by billions of them, you might still lose. There might still be something that catches anyway. But if you can prevent those embers from getting into your house, in a lot of cases, you prevent that house from burning, and then maybe prevent your neighbor's house from burning, because the most likely way that your neighbor's house burns is if your house is the one generating the embers. And so this is sort of a positive feedback that is also constructive. Positive feedback, of course, means self-reinforcing, but in this case, it's a positive feedback. The fewer ignitions there are in the urban landscape during a fire, the fewer subsequent ignitions are going to be downwind. And so thinking about, do we really need those wooden fences? Do you really need that wooden deck? Do you really need that juniper brush right up against the side of your house, or that palm tree lined street? Believe it or not, palm trees are incredibly flammable, as we saw during this fire under windy conditions. So granted, a lot of people might consider the palm trees to be iconic in Southern California, but they're not native to Southern California. And, there are all sorts of things you can do. Now, if you make those choices in your own property, right, will that totally solve the problem? No, but will it improve your odds? Definitely. If there's community level standards, if there's city, county, state level codes that mandate that people do some basic things to make their own structures more resilient.
Not even all that costly, the way you're describing it.
Not all that costly in some of these cases. I've essentially forced friends and family to put in ember-resistant vents because it's so simple and so relatively inexpensive. Most people can do it themselves, and yet gives you such a great advantage relative to not having them that it's almost a no-brainer.
I have one last question. From your study of the physics of climate, what knobs are getting turned in the physics drivers to send climate to record extremes rather than just simple extremes that we'd all experience in our lifetime?
Well, there's a lot of things going on, but one of the things I think about the most is something that I call, and that we actually just officially coined the term in the peer-reviewed literature last week, the expanding atmospheric sponge effect. Now imagine for a moment just an ordinary kitchen sponge, and you can actually replicate this, by the way, with a sponge and then a comically oversized one. The larger sponge, of course, has a greater capacity to absorb water. If you spill a glass of water on the counter, the small sponge is probably adequate. If you spill a bucket of water, you're going to need your comically oversized sponge. If you then wring out the comically oversized saturated sponge over your sink, it's going to yield a lot more water than the small one. That's the analogy for why the atmosphere and its increased propensity to hold water vapor, essentially, in a warming climate allows for example, more intense precipitation extremes, heavier downpour. So upping the ante, raising the ceiling on how intense precipitation can become. But this analogy also works, by the way, in reverse. If you have that comically oversized sponge, but you don't spill the bucket of water, there's no water available to evaporate, that sponge still retains that evaporative capacity. If you're not raining, if you're not bringing significantly more precipitation to a particular place at a particular time, the atmosphere is thirstier than it used to be. It wants to extract more and more of that moisture like a large sponge out of the landscape. So this expanding atmospheric sponge effect sort of explains a lot of what's going on in terms of flood risk and drought risk and wildfire risk. And of course, the underlying cause is just the fact that the air is warmer than it used to be.
Got a bigger sponge. Okay. That it can't get simpler than that.
I hope so. That's sort of why we're thinking in those terms. It's something that is surprisingly intuitive and explains a lot of what we're seeing all around us today.
Well, that's the whole point of these explainers, to try to get people a little closer to the science of what is driving our lives. So, Daniel Swain, thank you for sharing your precious time with us. We know you're in high demand by every news outlet in the country. Thanks for putting us on that very same list. It's great to make contact with you. And again, thanks for being part of this.
Thanks for having me.
So our deepest sympathies to all those in Los Angeles who've been affected by these fires, especially to those who have lost their homes and to some even their lives. Till next time, all I can say is what I say every time. Keep looking up.